The criminal world of Liverpool was seriously shaken. Three guys broke into a father and son's house and made off with a 30-kilogram stash of prohibited substances. The robbery sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. The gang that owned the stolen batch was once considered untouchable. A secret informant reported that the guys who lost goods worth £1 million were at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. No one could believe that someone would dare to steal from them. Police managed to crack the case by gaining access to their phones, and in May 2022, some of them found themselves behind bars. However, Liverpool's gangs were still furious and tried to get to anyone they believed was involved in the heist. Rumors circulated that 35-year-old Joseph Nee had been gathering information for them. Joseph Nee had only recently been released from prison, where he served time for drug distribution and robbery. He was granted early release and was required to comply with parole conditions. Nee was part of a gang that trafficked Class A controlled substances into Liverpool, the most dangerous of them all. Joseph wasn't considered the most popular guy even within his criminal circle, and some had even targeted him before because even his own associates viewed him as an informant and a snitch. On August 22, 2022, Joseph and his friends gathered at a mutual acquaintance's house to watch a football match between Liverpool and United. The game ended at 21:52, and shortly after, Joseph left the house with one of his friends, Paul Abraham. Later, Paul would recount that they were simply walking down the street when, at 21:59, they heard three loud pops. Of course, they had heard such sounds before and instantly recognized them as gunshots. The men started running. The shooter circled around and began firing at the men from behind at close range. The attacker was very close to his target and, of course, knew how to handle a firearm. As a result, the bullet struck Joseph in the upper abdomen, and he fell immediately. Paul Abraham leaped over his fallen, wounded friend and sprinted towards the park gates. It might not have been the noblest behavior towards a friend, but perhaps he knew that it wasn't worth risking his life for Joseph. At that moment, the armed man was in a perfect position. Unlike his victim, Joseph lay unarmed, wounded, and defenseless on the ground, while the stranger, dressed in black and wearing a balaclava, confidently approached him, holding a 9mm pistol. Joseph begged for mercy, but the stranger paid no attention to his pleas and coldly squeezed the trigger. The shot could only have been lethal, but obviously the universe was on Joseph's side at that moment. As they say, the gun jammed and it didn't fire. Joseph didn't miss this chance to jump up and, despite his wound, run away. Surprisingly, the shooter was prepared for any turn of events. He calmly retrieved two weapons, a revolver, and continued the pursuit, never ceasing to fire. Meanwhile, Joseph was running in the direction of King's Hit Avenue, an ordinary street where ordinary families lived. This was the home of 46-year-old Cheryl Corbell and her three children, Chloe, Ryan, and their younger sister, 9-year-old Olivia, who everyone called Liv. Of course, all the residents on the street who were at home heard that there was some commotion outside. Some realized that these were gunshots, while others were puzzled about what was happening. Among them was Cheryl. The woman opened the door and looked out onto the street, as many would have done in her place. However, Joseph noticed the light in the partially open door, and he ran as fast as he could toward Cheryl's house. The woman was horrified to see an injured man approaching her, followed by an armed man in a mask. Quickly assessing the situation and realizing that it was not worth getting involved in the gang's altercation, she rushed back into the house and tried to slam the door. Unfortunately, the dropped latch prevented her from doing so. Joseph, desperate to escape and knowing that his time was running out because his pursuer was about to catch up with him, pounded on the door, begging the homeowner for help. Cheryl had already realized that these were some criminal gang troubles, and being a Liverpool resident, she understood that she and her family would face trouble if she got involved in something like this. So, she ordered the man to leave. She must have felt sorry for the wounded man, but her desire to protect her own children outweighed everything else. However, Joseph had no intention of leaving. He threw himself against the door with all his weight, breaking inside, knowing that this would bring enormous problems to the family. The man burst inside and collapsed on the floor, weakened from the chase and the gunshot wound. But the pursuer didn't back down. He saw Joseph Nee enter the house. Another person might have thought that there would always be another day, another opportunity to reach the target. But the shooter had no intention of giving up. He had a mission to accomplish, regardless of who he harmed. The commotion near the front door of the house, which had now shifted into the hallway, was accompanied by noise. Chloe, Ryan, and Olivia were sleeping, but they woke up due to the loud sounds. Ryan recalls that he was in his room when he heard 3 loud noises followed by quick footsteps. It was his younger sister, Olivia, running downstairs crying out, "Mom, I'm scared!" Ryan also came out of his room but stayed at the top of the stairs, watching in bewilderment as chaos unfolded below. He looked down and wondered who this man lying in the hallway was. He saw his mother trying to close the door, and his younger sister stood just a few steps away from the front door. Olivia wanted to be closer to her mother. She went down to her, crying, "Mom, I'm scared! Mom, I'm scared!" The assailant at this moment could not ignore the child's cries. He knew that Joseph Nee had burst into the home of an ordinary family with no connection to their disputes. He saw Cheryl trying to eject the stranger from the house, saw Joseph attempting to get inside, and heard Olivia's cries. However, none of this mattered to him because he simply started shooting through the gap in the door without thinking about where the bullets might hit. A bullet struck Cheryl, entering her right hand. But even though she was in pain, she continued to battle with the door. Joseph, at this moment, regained his senses to the point where he began to help her. He shouted at her to call the police because the shooter was still trying to force his way in. The shooter managed to push his hand with the revolver through the gap in the door. While Joseph began to plead with him to stop again, Cheryl jammed the door, including his hand with the weapon, before he began shooting once more. A bullet hit the door frame. Finally, the shooter decided he had spent too much time and retreated. Cheryl was able to breathe a sigh of relief, stopped struggling with the door, and rushed to comfort her daughter. She wasn't concerned about her own wound. The most important thing was to hug Olivia and tell her that everything would be okay, that no one would harm her now. Cheryl noticed that there was a lot of blood on Olivia's pajamas and thought that her wound on her arm was bleeding heavily. But then she lifted her daughter's shirt and realized that it wasn't her blood. Olivia had been shot. The same bullet that had injured Cheryl had gone through her right hand and into Olivia's chest. Olivia was gasping for air. Her mother knelt beside her, begging her daughter to stay with her. Ryan, who still hadn't realized that his sister was wounded, began shouting at Joseph to get out, but the uninvited guest had no intention of staying. Joseph managed to make a call and was picked up by his 2 friends in an SUV. They rushed him to the hospital, not giving a second thought to the condition they left the family members in, whose lives had just been forever changed. They simply abandoned them amidst all the chaos. While Cheryl called for help, she held Olivia in her arms and instructed her son to continuously apply pressure to the wound on Olivia's chest. Only then did the boy realize that his sister was injured. Olivia's lips had turned blue, and the bleeding had stopped. Ryan assisted his mother in carrying Olivia upstairs. They tried to stop the bleeding with towels. A neighbor arrived, attempting to offer some assistance. Cheryl desperately tried to keep Olivia conscious. Later, she would tell the police that at some point, Olivia's body went limp and her eyes rolled upwards. It was at that moment that Cheryl realized Olivia had passed away. The police arrived at 10:10 p.m. An officer felt Olivia's faint heartbeat, and they carried her out of the house, rushing her to the nearest children's hospital in an ambulance. They held on to hope, but the doctors were unable to do anything. Olivia was pronounced dead at 11:24 p.m. Cheryl wasn't by her side when she passed, as she was receiving medical attention herself. Just a few hours earlier, it had been a normal, happy family, and now a mother and son were left as witnesses to the death of their 9-year-old daughter and sister. Meanwhile, a man named Thomas Cashman, known as Tommy, dressed in black but without the balaclava, rushed to the home of his former lover with whom he had a very brief affair. He entered her house without permission, scaring her terribly as he entered her bedroom. He was agitated and claimed that someone had tried to kill him and he wanted to kill that person in return. In other words, he needed her help, and he was willing to say anything to get it. He even stated that she was the only one he could trust, despite having a fiancée with whom he had spent many years. The woman believed Tommy and offered him shelter for the night. However, the next morning, when all the media were buzzing about the shocking crime, she realized that Tommy had been involved in the shootout and was responsible for the death of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Korbel. Now, involuntarily, she became an accomplice. The woman was horrified by this prospect. On one hand, she didn't want to cover up a child killer, but on the other hand, any Liverpool resident knows how dangerous it can be to cross paths with criminal gangs. Uncertain about what to do, She called her boyfriend, Paul Russell. Paul arrived and had a private conversation with Tommy. Tommy immediately confessed to Paul that he had been hunting Joseph, but was abruptly cut off by Joseph, who asked him not to say anything about it to avoid implicating him in the crime. It was a very reasonable move on Joseph's part. What remains unclear is why he later made a significant mistake, giving Tommy different clothes, helping him get rid of the items he was wearing, and taking him to where his car was parked. Perhaps Paul understood that Tommy could pose a threat to him or his girlfriend and chose to assist him. But this act of help to a killer will likely have serious consequences for Paul as well. During this period, the investigation into the murder was in progress. Joseph Nee, who had suffered injuries, much like Cheryl and Olivia, declined to cooperate with the police. His primary concern was self-preservation, as the looming threat of returning to prison for violating his parole weighed heavily on him. Despite being involved in the criminal underworld, Joseph should have been able to surmise the identity of his assailant and whose orders the killer was following. Nevertheless, he informed the officers that anyone could have taken a shot at him that night. It's noteworthy that Joseph was not the only one apprehensive about engaging with law enforcement. Olivia had become the third Liverpool resident to succumb to gunshot wounds within a week, not to mention the numerous incidents where victims were shot but survived. In a city aptly nicknamed the British Amsterdam, crossing paths with criminal gangs was indeed perilous. A reward for information on Olivia's assailant had been announced, which quickly swelled to a record-high amount of £200,000, thanks to an anonymous contributor who added £100,000 to the fund. However, despite this substantial incentive, no one came forward with information. Nonetheless, the police succeeded in identifying a suspect, 34-year-old Thomas Cashman. He was a father of two, aged 4 and 14, engaged to a girl he had been dating since their school days. The family resided in a spacious suburban house in West Derby. Tommy had previously worked at a car wash, but his current lifestyle was vastly different. Officially unemployed, he rented a house that, in reality, belonged to the gang's leader. It was evident that his involvement in criminal activities afforded him a lavish life. Fortunately, Liverpool boasted extensive CCTV coverage, making it challenging to perpetrate an attack without being captured on camera. Investigation revealed that at 8:30 p.m., Tommy returned home, swiftly changed into black attire, and left his residence. He didn't make much effort to conceal himself while hunting his target. Surveillance footage documented him passing the house on Finch Lane several times before traversing past it once more. Tommy was convinced that his target was inside that house, having closely monitored his movements. He had even attempted to attack him earlier that day, though that endeavor had failed. When Joseph finally left the house, Tommy was resolute in his intent to eliminate him. However, fate took a different course, and an innocent bystander fell victim to a stray bullet. Such are the consequences when the worlds of ordinary individuals and criminals collide. Tommy's trousers, which he had provided to Paul Russell, were discovered at his sister's residence bearing his DNA. Gunpowder residue was also found on his right leg. Video evidence, DNA profiling, and gunpowder residue collectively linked him to the attack on Joseph. Yet the investigation had another valuable asset: a courageous witness who risked his life to oppose Liverpool's criminal underworld. In the early hours of September 4th, 2022, Tommy was apprehended while hiding at a friend's apartment. In October 2022, Tommy was formally charged with Olivia's murder, the attempted murder of Joseph and Cheryl, as well as possession of a firearm. Paul Russell faced charges of aiding and abetting, despite his earnest efforts to distance himself from the case. The trial of Tommy took place in Manchester in March 2023. Tommy denied all allegations. He claimed he hadn't killed anyone and that he appeared on the video because he was a local drug dealer, making deliveries that day and buying toys for his sick child. He added that he had no intention of killing anyone that day and that he had been friends with Joseph Nee for the past 10 years. However, his words were completely contradicted by a key prosecution witness. The remarkable effect came when Tommy's former girlfriend, who had sheltered him immediately after the crime, appeared in court. It was an incredibly brave move on her part, considering she lived in a city where many of Tommy's friends and gang members resided. Naturally, she would be protected under a witness protection program. As the police stated, she received more threats of violence than any other witness in Merseyside police history. She had to completely abandon her previous life, yet she chose to do the right thing. The witness explained her decision by saying that one should not be afraid to come forward when it involves the murder of a 9-year-old Olivia. The witness described how the accused came to her after the murder, trying to secure her support to create a false alibi. It's unclear why he couldn't ask his own fiancée for this favor. Tommy's defense team attempted to twist her words, suggesting that she wanted to frame her former lover because he refused to leave his fiancée for her. It was an absurd attempt to discredit the witness, and despite their efforts, she remained highly convincing. Following the witness's example, other people also found the courage to approach the police. They revealed that within criminal circles, Tommy was known as a contract killer or a hitman. He had been hired for various murders and was suspected in other homicide cases and assassination attempts, including another attempt on Joseph Nee's life with the same weapon used to kill Olivia on that fateful day. In fact, the same weapon had been used on January 27, 2020, when a 19-year-old was shot. It was evident that Tommy had hired a criminal cartel to assassinate Joseph Nee. On March 30th, after 3.5 weeks of court proceedings, the jury unanimously found Thomas Cashman guilty on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled for April 3rd. On the same day, Olivia's family intended to address the court, speaking to the murderer and recounting how the crime he committed had affected their entire family. However, Tommy refused to even appear in court on that day. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole at a minimum of 42 years, making him 76 years old upon potential release. The judge commented on her decision, explaining that she would have preferred to sentence him to life without parole. However, she had to acknowledge the fact that Tommy didn't intend to kill Olivia. If he had intended to kill a child, he would have received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It was evident to everyone in court that his target was another criminal. The judge took into consideration that he was also a father and wouldn't be able to see his children as often as he would have liked, but that was solely his own fault. She emphasized that the man's refusal to appear in court was not taken into account. Paul Russell was also found guilty of aiding and abetting and is currently in prison awaiting his sentence. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, had hoped to look the killer in the eyes and express her thoughts about him. However, he deprived her of this opportunity by not appearing in court. Cheryl admits that she didn't know he could simply choose not to come. Therefore, Olivia's family, particularly Cheryl and Olivia's Aunt Antonia, are advocating for changes in the law to require criminals to appear in court during sentencing and meet face-to-face with the victims' families. Since Olivia's murder, not much time has passed, and her mother admits that during these few months, she has been driven to madness by the deafening silence in their home. Olivia, from her childhood, was a chatterbox and giggler. If Olivia had survived in just 5 days, she would have performed a truly noble act. She intended to donate her hair to a charitable organization. She was eager to help an organization that makes wigs for sick children and had decided to cut off a whole 12 inches of her locks. People would have understood what a tremendous gesture it was coming from a 9-year-old girl. Giving a piece of herself to another child who needed it more would have shown just how wonderful Olivia was. The complete opposite of the people who invaded her home that August night in 2022 when Olivia took a bullet meant for a criminal. In memory of Olivia, other children created a beautiful corner in the park where she loved to play. They painted an enormous butterfly on the wall and planted flowers of a beautiful pink color. During Olivia's farewell at the church, hundreds of people gathered. Everything was adorned with pink butterflies. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, bid a moving farewell to her daughter, saying that Liv was loved and adored by everyone who knew her. She will never be forgotten. Cheryl added, "I won't say goodbye, but I'll say goodnight. I love you. We'll see you in the morning." June 2011. The first days of summer brought bright sunshine to the town of Pau in the Atlantic Pyrenees, a department in the southwest of France. Like many children of divorced parents, 14-year-old Alexandre Junca lived with his mother from Monday to Friday and spent the weekends with his father. Saturday, June 4th, 2011, was just such a weekend. The beginning of this story will seem familiar to all parents of a teenage child. The time had come when the son asked to be allowed to go to his very first party. His heart said no, but Alexandre's father, Philippe, knew that he couldn't lock the boy up in 4 walls and forbid him from socializing with his friends. Alexandre and Philippe had a trusting relationship, and the father allowed his son to go, but insisted he return by 8 p.m. Of course, that was too early. and after a brief negotiation, father and son agreed that the teenager would be home by 10 p.m., not a minute later. Philippe comforted himself with the thought that his son was already 14 years old, knew how to behave around strangers, and had promised to come back on time. Besides, both summer and youth would pass by quickly, and the boy should have time to enjoy both. So Alexandre got on his bike and went to meet his friends. He was gone for almost half the day. At 9:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before he was supposed to be home, he sent his father a message. The teenager wrote that he would be late but promised to arrive by 11 p.m., no later. However, at 11 o'clock, Alexandre didn't show up, nor did he send another message. His father tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Philippe told himself that his son had probably run out of battery on his phone, stayed overnight at a friend's house, and would return in the morning. However, the next morning, Alexandre didn't come home. His father panicked. He called his daughter, Alexandre's older sister. She was 17, close to her brother, and would know where he was. At the very least, she might know who he spent the evening with, but the girl knew nothing. Philippe rushed out to search for his son on the streets of the city. Midday was approaching. By 7 p.m., Alexandre's mother, Philippe's ex-wife, Valérie Lance, was supposed to pick him up. Philippe called her to let her know they had a problem. Their son was missing. Valérie decided they needed to contact the police. At 8 p.m., she went to the station to report her son missing. In her mind, she was replaying all the horrible things that could have happened to her child. However, the police didn't share her concern. They offered a completely different explanation. They bluntly told the worried mother that teenagers often run away from home, especially children of divorced parents. Valérie assured them that she and her ex-husband had tried to make the separation as painless as possible for the kids, and besides, it had happened 10 years ago. The officers then asked if Alexandre had any problems at school, but this theory was also disproven. Alexandre was fairly popular, well-liked by both teachers and classmates. Meanwhile, Philippe was still driving through every street in the city. Just 50 meters from his house, he spotted Alexandre's bike, locked to a post. The bike was in working condition, so why had he stopped so close to his father's house? Philippe immediately informed the boy's mother. The next day, given that the police had not taken any action to search for the teenager, the parents themselves found the kids with whom their son had spent the day. In the afternoon, the teenagers were skating at the skate park, and then at 5:30 p.m., they went to a party in the suburbs of Zaragoza. They stayed there until around 7 p.m., after which they all went to a friend's house to continue hanging out. At 10:45 p.m., Alexandre said that it was time for him to go home, said goodbye to everyone, and left. It was only about 1.5 kilometers from there to his father's house. Something must have happened during this short ride. Frustrated by the lack of response from the police, Valérie and Philippe turned to the local press. The next day, newspapers published the missing teenager's photograph. Naturally, the police had no choice but to start working. Over the next 2 weeks, the officers searched every house and building between the location where the teenagers had been hanging out and Philippe's house. This led to nothing. No one had seen Alexandre. However, between these 2 points on the map was a post office building with a working surveillance camera. Alexandre appeared on video at 10:51 p.m. He was riding his bike along the side of the road. No one was following him, and he wasn't running away from anyone. Alexandre was just 500 meters from his father's house. Everything indicated that he should have made it home on time. 3 weeks after Alexandre's disappearance, 2 homeless people who had settled by the banks of the Gave de Pau River noticed something in the water. The discovery resembled part of a human leg. The media reported the gruesome find, but stated that the body part belonged to an adult male. However, a DNA test confirmed that it was the leg of 14-year-old Alexandre. It had been severed after his death. Experts were adamant about this conclusion. When the boy's parents were informed of the discovery, Valérie began to scream uncontrollably. She kept repeating, "It's not him! Not him!" No one argued with her. They simply offered to conduct a second test. The mother eventually had to accept the horrific truth. The fact that her 14-year-old son had been killed was already awful, but the idea that his body had been dismembered afterward was unbearable. The teenager's leg was found in the Gave de Pau River, which flows through the city of Pau. As a result, the police began their investigation. They scoured the river upstream and downstream, climbed the roofs of nearby buildings, and examined the sewer system. But nothing more was found. However, they recalled the extensive work that had been done on the river near the place where part of the teenager's body was found. A temporary dam had been constructed there, essentially a mound of earth and gravel. What if the remains were buried underneath it? Of course, they needed permission to excavate the recently built dam. It took some time, but the authorization was granted. Excavators began their work, digging for days. Alexander's mother, Valerie, was always present during the search. She feared what they might find, but believed she had to be there for her son. She noticed that the police had brought in a search dog specialized in locating bodies. The dog pointed to several spots, after which the police set up tarps to shield the excavation site. Unable to bear the suspense, Valerie asked the officers if they had found anything, and she read the answer in their eyes. Everyone avoided her gaze until one of them nodded, confirming what she already feared. They had found almost all of Alexandra's body parts. The remains were taken by a forensic pathologist who determined the cause of Alexandra's death. The teenager had been struck multiple times in the face with a hammer. However, the pathologist was interested in more than just the cause of death. It was crucial to determine whether the killer had any knowledge of anatomy and what tool was used for dismemberment. First of all, the forensic expert confirmed his initial conclusion that Alexandra was dismembered post-mortem. But he also discovered something else interesting. The body was initially dismembered by someone who clearly had no experience with such actions. This person then turned to someone more skilled in this area, likely a hunter or butcher, someone accustomed to cutting up carcasses. Thus, it became clear that the 14-year-old boy had been killed by blows to the face with a hammer, after which his body was cut into pieces and buried. But the questions remained. Who did this, and where was the crime scene? The police had one clue: the bicycle, which had been locked to a post just 50 meters from his father's house. Why Alexander had locked his functioning bicycle remains unknown. However, it suggested that the attack likely occurred very close to his father's home, possibly on the street nearby. The police continued to work hard on this case, although at first they did not take Alexander's disappearance seriously. As soon as they took up the case, they worked tirelessly. However, they made no progress in the investigation. Finally, in July 2012, Alexander's body was handed over to his parents and they were allowed to bury him. They received 2 bags. One contained bones and the other organs. It is difficult to convey the pain of the parents who had to bury 2 bags, everything that remained of their loving, cheerful, and joyful boy. The funeral took place. Maria provided several condolence books in which everyone could write something. Then they were handed to the parents so they could read some pleasant things about their son, how other people remembered Alexander. Valerie reread these entries. One of them intrigued and troubled her. Someone had written, "I know what happened to you. I'm sorry for your parents. The jerk who did this is underground." And the signature, Homeless Mike. Valerie handed the condolence book to the police. The police took this lead seriously. First, because there were indeed many homeless people living in the city, and these individuals often notice a lot while remaining unnoticed themselves. Second, they suspected who it was about. Mike is indeed homeless. He is a physically very exhausted man. He always looks a little lost, follows bad company, and can even show aggression. During the interrogation, Mike stated that he did not remember the evening of June 4th, 2011. He knows nothing and did not write the message addressed to the deceased boy. Furthermore, the man cannot read or write. Realizing that the trail of Mike was leading to a dead end, the police continued to dig deeper. They were interested in all homeless individuals who could be called Mike, as well as Michael or Michelle. They discovered that in the vicinity of homeless Mike, there is a second Mike, although in reality the young man's name is Michael. 25-year-old Michael Barrell had a troubled childhood. He left home early, committed petty crimes, and wandered around the country. But since 2009, he had been living in Po with his girlfriend, 45-year-old Fatima Enadia. Fatima was 20 years older than her boyfriend. She used illegal substances and had mental health issues. The investigators naturally wanted to bring Michael in for questioning. However, he was already in prison. Michael had been incarcerated for more than a year for assaulting another homeless man with a hammer. It turned out that Michael always had a hammer with him. Moreover, the assault occurred just a week after Alexander's murder. The hammer was, of course, seized as evidence. The police requested this evidence to test for Alexander's DNA. Unfortunately, they found no DNA. But the police also examined the young man's phone data on the night of the murder. On the evening of Alexander's disappearance, his phone was in the same area where the boy was last seen, and 12 days later at 5 a.m., Michael's phone appeared at the dam where the body was found. Furthermore, on the night of the murder, he made many calls. He called his girlfriend Fatima and persistently tried to reach someone named Claude. He called him 9 times. Claude is a 72-year-old retiree living in a village 40 kilometers from Po. He has his own farm. Claude did not answer Michael's calls all night and half of the next day. When Michael finally managed to get in touch with the man, he arrived at Fatima's house just an hour later. What could connect people like Fatima, Mike, and Michael with a respected elderly farmer from the suburbs? The investigators still had to find that out, although they already had their suspicions. After all, Claude was a hunter. Just under 2 years after Alexander's murder, the judge authorized the arrest of Mike, Fatima, Claude, and Michael, who was already in prison. Each of them was interrogated separately. The conversation with Michael progressed unexpectedly quickly. He recounted that that June day had gone horribly wrong. He had a fight with Fatima because he suspected she was cheating on him. After the argument, he went out to take a walk with his friend homeless Mike to blow off some steam. On the street, he encountered a teenager on a bicycle. The teenager said nothing to him and did nothing, but Michael was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, was very angry, and wanted to let off steam. As he passed by the boy, Michael pushed him and then grabbed his hammer. He smashed the head of the completely unfamiliar teenager to calm down because he was angry at his girlfriend. He had no other explanation. Then he moved the body of his victim to a basement, although he claimed he could not remember which one. The investigators were convinced that it was the basement of Fatima's house. Michael described how he tried to reach Claude to help him get rid of the body. Claude only showed up the next day. The man put the teenager in the trunk of his car, took him home, did what he needed to do there, and a few days later brought back parts of the body. Almost 2 weeks after the murder, Michael and Claude buried the parts of the body together under the dam. Next, the investigators interrogated Claude. The man denied everything. The investigators asked him why Michael had called him 9 times immediately after the murder if he wasn't asking for help. And why did Claude show up the next day after listening to his messages? But the elderly man insisted that he was not involved in the crime. He went to meet Michael because they had a relationship. Claude sometimes paid Michael for intimacy. That is, that Sunday, he went to him not because of the corpse, but to satisfy his own intimate needs. The officers searched Claude's car, a Peugeot 605. They wanted to check the vehicle for Alexander's DNA, but unexpectedly, they found out that this was not the right car. The man had bought an identical vehicle, only a different color. He had repainted it and switched the license plate so that it would be impossible to distinguish it from his old car. Claude had sent his previous car to the junkyard, where it had already been sent for recycling. It was sent to the melting shop. Thus, he changed cars without changing them. This is a well-known trick in the criminal world, and the police asked a perfectly logical question. Why would a peaceful retiree go to such lengths with a car? Moreover, Claude's phone data confirmed that, like Michael, he was at the dam 12 days after the teenager's disappearance, when the men presumably buried parts of the body. While the 4 defendants were in custody, the police continued to gather evidence against them. Suddenly, they discovered that homeless Mike could not be connected to Alexander's murder. On June 4, 2011, he was 200 kilometers away from the city of Pau. This means that Michael lied when he claimed he was walking with him that evening. The investigating judge interrogated him again, and Michael Barrow stated that he was indeed not alone that evening, but not with Mike. This is when the 4th character enters the scene, 22-year-old Christophe Camille, another young man with a complicated fate. Since childhood, his father had abused him, and his mother completely ignored him. He ended up in a mental health clinic and was supposed to stay there on the night of the murder. However, that day was his birthday. The doctors let him go to celebrate his birthday with friends. The young man wanted to smoke but didn't have any cigarettes. He hoped that the tobacco shop, which was open until 11 p.m., would be open, but he didn't know what time it was. A teenager rode by on a bicycle. Christophe didn't know his name, but it was Alexander. Christophe asked Alexander what time it was. The boy stopped and took out his mobile phone to check the time. Upon seeing the phone, Christophe grabbed it and ran, colliding with Michael. Michael wanted to take the phone from Christophe. At that moment, Alexander had locked his bike to a post and approached to demand his phone back. Michael didn't like this. He was in a state where a light spark was enough to ignite him. He pushed Alexander, took out a hammer, and began to hit the boy in the face again and again, while Christophe was running away from the crime scene. The missing link was this, Christophe. It was because of him that the boy didn't make it home just 50 meters away. In 2 minutes, a completely senseless crime occurred. Alexander was killed over a mobile phone that his mother had bought for him for €9. After Michael's confession, homeless Mike was released. The others were charged. Christophe confirmed that he was there but did not kill Alexander. Fatima and Claude did not confess to anything. Claude swore that he did nothing with the boy's body, while the woman claimed she knew nothing despite the bloodstains found in her basement. Interestingly, Fatima called the police on June 17th and June 26th regarding her boyfriend. However, the operator simply didn't believe her because, being mentally ill, she constantly called the police with various messages. At the very beginning of the trial, the judges made an unexpected decision. Until then, all four had been arrested in connection with the murder, but the judges decided that their actions fell not under murder, but rather under robbery with aggravating circumstances, robbery involving violence, leading to death. In other words, in the judge's opinion, there was no intention to kill the boy, and Alexander's parents had to come to terms with this. The trial began in June 2016, 5 years after Alexander's death. At the end of the proceedings, the mother of the murdered boy was allowed to address Michael personally, and she demanded that he tell the truth about what happened that night and hide nothing. No one expected that his account would have the effect of a bombshell. Michael stood up and, to the horror of everyone present, confessed that Alexander was alive when he brought him into Fatima's house. The boy opened his eyes, cried, and even began to scream. Fatima gave him medication, and Michael became enraged again, instinctively grabbing the hammer once more. It was then that he killed the teenager. Michael ended his story by asserting that this was the true truth, and perhaps it was, but it was simply unbearable for the parents, for the boy's friends, for the townspeople, and for everyone who heard this story. The parents found solace in the fact that their son died very quickly, but he was alive for some time, and the criminals could have let him go, but chose to kill him instead. Michael was sentenced to life imprisonment. Christophe was sentenced to 15 years. Fatima received only 3 years for failing to report the crime. Claude received 3 years for destroying evidence and what he did with the body. He committed a crime posthumously, which is punishable by the maximum sentence of 3 years. Claude was the only one who tried to appeal, but his sentence remained in effect. We often hear that crimes committed by strangers, especially when the victim is a child, are rare. Moreover, the hammer as a murder weapon also typically indicates the personal hatred of the murderer towards the victim. That is why it is so hard to believe that such a thing could really happen. One person stole the boy's phone, which his mother bought for him for €9. Another killed a completely unknown 14-year-old boy with a hammer, who had done nothing to him. The woman in whose basement the victim was finished off did not report it to the police, and the respected pensioner, a farmer, an elderly man, dismembered the boy's body and helped bury it under the dam, and no one thought to stop and consider what they were doing until it was too late.
Plots that real life creates are sometimes more incredible than the most inventive fiction. This case, which gains such wide publicity due to its similarity to the plot of a famous thriller, is yet another confirmation. Because even in the most unimaginable horror movies, one can find more meaning than in the life of this seemingly ordinary family. The Maguad family is a typical middle-class family living in the province of Cotabato in the Philippines. Cruz Maguad is a teacher for senior classes in a school, while his wife Lavella holds the position of a primary school director. Cruz and Lavella were happy parents to their 18-year-old daughter, Crisol Gwen, and 16-year-old son, Crisvel Louis, affectionately known as Boy Boy. Louis was excelling in his studies, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. He was the person others sought out with their problems because he always had the right words to say and knew how to uplift a friend. Gwen, like her brother, was a very popular teenager. She attended preparatory courses at the university and planned to pursue a career in medicine. In her free time, she participated in beauty pageants and sports competitions. In other words, Gwen had it all: loving and caring parents, beauty, intelligence, and a wonderful personality. She also possessed an incredibly kind heart. It was precisely because of her kindness that, in July 2021, the Maguad family experienced an addition. But not a baby, rather another teenager. During a family gathering, Gwen met a 17-year-old girl named Janice, who had been helping either the relatives or friends of the Magwood family to care for their two young children. The two girls quickly became friends, and Janice shared with Gwen that she was an orphan, practically homeless, and under the care of authorities. She expressed her desire not to be with the children anymore and dreamt of living with Gwen. Compassionate Gwen asked her parents to allow Janice to move in with them, and surprisingly, they agreed. Being teachers, they felt the need to help children, especially those in need. Moreover, they were genuinely afraid that if they didn't accept Janice into their family, something bad might happen to her, and she might even be forced into undesirable circumstances. Cruz and Lavella couldn't bear to let that happen, so in July 2021, they essentially adopted Janice. They not only welcomed her into their family but cared for her as if she were their own daughter, assisting her with her studies and even discussing her future college plans. Of course, there were difficulties at the beginning. Within the first month of Janice moving in, the family's 10,000 pesos, approximately 15,000 rubles, went missing. The money was quickly found hidden in Janice's backpack. When confronted, she tearfully apologized, and Gwen pleaded for her to be given a second chance. Understanding that Janice wasn't accustomed to this life and couldn't resist the temptation to take the money, Cruz and Lavella forgave her. Surprisingly, after this incident, the bonds in the family became even stronger and better. Gwen grew attached to Janice, caring for her as if she were a sister. Even Louis gave up his room and slept on the couch in the living room so that Janice could have her own bedroom. Surrounded by love and care, Janice blossomed and reciprocated the affection within her new family. On December 10, 2021, at 2:58 p.m., Cruz Magwood was fixing something at the school where his wife worked when he received a call, urgently telling him to return home because burglars had broken into their house. It took him about 17 minutes to rush home. He swung open the gate, and ran to the front door. Near the entrance, he found a blood-soaked blanket and a knife. He called out for his son, but there was no response. Cruz turned the doorknob to open the door, but it was locked. He then rushed to the back of the house, continuing to call for his son and daughter. Another door was also locked, so he had to break it down. Entering from the kitchen to the living room, he was stunned to see the bodies of his children lying in a pool of blood. His daughter was just a few steps away from her room, covered in bruises and knife wounds all over her body. Insects were already attracted to her blood. Louis was lying by the front door, bound by his hands and feet, with a gag in his mouth. His body also had multiple stab wounds, which seemed to have been inflicted recently. Beside Gwen and Louis lay a baseball bat, a hammer, and broken bottles. It is difficult to imagine the anguish the father felt finding his children in such a state. But he knew that there was another child, his adopted daughter, still inside the house, so he continued to search the rooms, fearing to find another lifeless body. Suddenly, the girl appeared, coming out of her room. Cruz recalls that she looked terrified. Her hair was wet, and she said she didn't hear his cries because she was in the shower. Cruz found her behavior strange but assumed that people react differently in shock, perhaps trying to dissociate themselves from reality by engaging in routine activities. In any case, Cruz didn't have time to dwell on it. He needed to call the police and inform his wife of the horrific incident, that someone brutally killed their son and daughter. Fortunately, there was a survivor of the attack, and when the police arrived, they promptly interviewed Janice. Once she regained her composure, she recounted that 3 masked men had broken into the house. She witnessed them launching vicious attacks on Louis. Frightened, Janice managed to hide under her bed in her room, trying to remain as quiet and inconspicuous as possible. Despite the fear, she was able to access Facebook and post a message, alerting others that intruders had entered the house. Apparently, someone saw the post and called Cruz, who immediately rushed home upon receiving the distressing news. The cruelty of the crime confirmed the girl's words. Considering that multiple weapons were used in the crime and that the robbers managed to overpower 2 teenagers, there must have been several killers. Judging by the bruises on Gwen's arms, she fought desperately for her life, but the attackers were too strong. The investigators quickly discovered that the perpetrators had enough time after the murder to clean up the blood and change their clothes in the family's bathroom. They then put the dirty items in a bag and attempted to dispose of it in the canal, but a branch blocked their path, leading to its discovery by forensic experts. However, Janice was clearly mistaken about some things. The pathologist determined that Luis couldn't have been killed first, as his wounds still appeared fresh when the father arrived home, while Gwen's blood had already begun to dry, attracting ants. The police noticed that Janice's room was in great disarray, as if the criminals meticulously searched every corner. In such a case, it would have been impossible not to notice someone hiding under the bed. Moreover, the rage with which the intruders attacked Gwen and Luis puzzled the investigators. Typically, burglars aim to find valuable items and leave the crime scene quickly, rather than attacking teenagers with such unprecedented cruelty. Especially since they didn't take anything valuable besides the victims' phones. It was also strange that the murder occurred around 2 a.m., but Janice posted a plea for help on Facebook at almost 3 a.m. Why did she wait almost an hour to report the attack on her brother and sister? Why choose a Facebook post instead of calling her parents or the police? She might have been afraid that the intruders would hear her, but it's difficult to imagine being in her position, when it's a matter of life and death, and fear grips every inch of your body. How one could write a lengthy post without making any mistakes and even selecting several sad emojis to illustrate her words. In any case, Gwen's boyfriend saw her post immediately and promptly called Janice. She answered, but remained silent, and there was an eerie silence in the background. Shortly after, Janice changed her name on Facebook and eventually deleted the post. However, the main clue to the identity of the culprit lay in the fact that all the weapons used in the crime belonged to the family. The fact that the burglars brought no weapons with them, and the baseball bat, knives, and hammer were all from the family's possessions, raised further questions. Only Gwen and Janice knew where the hammer was, as the Magwads had recently had guests, and Lavella asked her daughters to put it away so it wouldn't be in the way. The baseball bat was lying on the top bunk of Luis' two-story bed, which Janice now occupied. To use the bat, the intruder would have had to go into Janice's room and take it. These are not the places where a stranger unfamiliar with the layout of the house would find such items. Finally, the police lifted fingerprints from the baseball bat and compared them to Janice's, and they matched. The evidence continued to accumulate, pointing to the least likely suspect. Therefore, the police called Janice in for questioning once again. Finally, on December 16, when Janice was confronted with all the evidence that contradicted her statements, she confessed to her lawyer that she was the one who killed Gwen and Luis. But how did she manage to overpower two teenagers, aged 16 and 18? She had an accomplice, a 17-year-old boy named Carl, who served in the local church. The police shared screenshots of their conversations with the public, confirming that the murder was premeditated. Janice knew where the items that could be used as weapons were located, and she had everything prepared in advance. Janice admitted that envy towards Gwen and anger towards the teenagers pushed her to commit the murder. After her confession, Janice's friends and acquaintances revealed that she had always been quite two-faced. On one side, she presented herself as friendly, kind, and caring, but behind people's backs, she showed an entirely different side. She allegedly considered the Magwad family to be poor and spoke unfavorably about them. Cruz Magwad later stated, she was envious and insecure, so she resented Gwen. I've heard such things about her character. When she's angry with someone, she seeks to harm them. She dreamed of taking Gwen's place. Perhaps that's why on the day of Gwen and Luis's murder, Janice referred to Cruz and Lavella as her mom and dad. She wanted to be the only daughter in the family, receiving all the attention, care, and possibly money. Such uncontrollable behavior and the crimes she committed led the media to compare her to Esther, the main character of the movie Orphan. It's a thriller about a family that adopts a little girl with an angelic face, who turns out to be a heartless killer. Interestingly, It was one of Janice's favorite movies, and she even asked Cruz to watch it together, but he declined as he had already seen it and didn't like it. However, just like the movie character, Janice wasn't an orphan. Her parents are alive, and besides her, there are 3 more children in the family. However, her father neglected the family, didn't want to work, and they lived in almost poverty. Janice's parents separated when her mother found work in Davao City, the main port of Mindanao Island. Leaving for work, her mother left Janice under the care of her father. But since he practically didn't take care of the children, Janice was placed under the care of the Department of Social Welfare and Development of the Philippines for 8 years. On December 20, 2021, Gwen and Luisa bid their final farewell. The family didn't celebrate the New Year's festivities as they usually did, as it was a family holiday, and they couldn't find joy in welcoming the new year without Gwen and Luis. We extend our condolences to the parents of the slain teenagers. With new evidence, we are confident that we can achieve justice for their children, said Vice Governor of Cotabato, Emilu Mendoza. What's particularly sad about this case is that the main suspect in the murder of the teenagers is their adopted daughter, whom the family cared for as their own. It's unfathomable to imagine how a 17-year-old girl, who was given a second chance to live a better life with a loving adoptive family, could not only carry out but even conceive such a furious act of murder. Pending trial and sentencing, the accused are under the custody of the Department of Social Welfare and Development of the Philippines. Cruz and Lavella complained that the official Philippine authorities treat and care for underage criminals much better than they do for the underage victims. Lavella recounted her encounter with the accused during their official arraignment. We saw the criminals who didn't show any signs of remorse. One was properly dressed, in a black long-sleeved shirt tucked into blue jeans, wearing dark glasses, escorted by a social welfare worker and a plainclothes policeman, while the other came with a representative of the official Philippine authorities and their parents. I envied how well they looked, how they were protected. I wanted to confront them face to face or look them in the eyes and ask why. But I could only tightly hold my husband's hand and cry because we couldn't do anything since the law protects them. Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished 5th, right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the 3rd place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. She got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only won last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old. Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of 2 recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the 2 men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed? About getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Ulray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice two men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability, and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, The older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, she realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer. Revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live, not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, but the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag, while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Bob Svensson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Bob Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul, found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean, and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search, and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away, they'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her, I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought, she had been shot just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Alan, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Alan's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. No, she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Alan. But he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Alan, but this time, she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him, "There were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Alan in the head." With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused, and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help!" she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the 2 fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Dan as a handsome prince and the other man as a stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell t-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone? Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. On August 31, 2022, the police of Thurston County, Washington, started receiving calls from concerned motorists who had noticed an abandoned car on the highway. When officers arrived at the specified location, they realized that their concerns were not unfounded. The driver's side door was open, the key was still in the ignition, and there was dried blood on the steering wheel and door. A broken phone was lying on the ground next to the car. The phone had been last used at 5:10 p.m., and was discovered at 5:30 p.m. This means that whatever happened here happened very quickly. By checking the registration number, the police found that the car was registered to Kenneth Davis from Olympia, Washington, a city located 25 minutes away from where the car was found. However, when they contacted the man, they learned that his 16-year-old son, Gabriel Davis, had taken the car. Around 4 p.m., he had left for football practice at school but never showed up. It is obvious that blood and a broken phone are not a good sign. When something like this happens, several scenarios immediately come to mind, including a fight or possibly even a murder. The police hurried to gather as much information as possible about the boy. Gabriel Davis is a 16-year-old teenager from Olympia, Washington. Recently, his academic performance at school sharply declined, but his enthusiasm for football remained unchanged. He took his training seriously and never missed a session. Therefore, when he didn't show up at the stadium on August 31st, his absence was immediately noticed. Nobody, including his best friend Justin Yoon, knew his whereabouts. After the discovery of Gabriel's car, the broken phone, and the blood, the police immediately launched an extensive search. The search continued throughout the night, and the following morning, involving search teams and helicopters. As news of the boy's disappearance aired, calls started pouring in from people who claimed to have seen him. Around 5 individuals reported that they saw the teenager walking along the highway. He was alone and heading towards the park. One caller even spoke to Gabriel and asked if everything was all right, to which he replied, yes. The most horrifying aspect was that the mysterious disappearance of the young man was not the first or even the second occurrence in the county. Over the past 6 years, 2 other young boys vanished within a 5-mile radius of where Gabriel's car was found. Local residents were convinced that he became the 3rd victim of the same abductor and demanded immediate action from the police. The missing boys were named Matthew Anfelt and Logan Schendelman. Like Gabriel, Matthew and Logan were actively involved in sports during their senior years. The cases bore striking similarities, particularly with Logan's situation. His car was also found abandoned on the roadside, and it was unclear why he was in the southern part of the county where he had no reason to be. Furthermore, in both cases, witnesses reported seeing the boys before their disappearances. However, Matthew and Logan were never found. Due to these similarities and the urgency of Gabriel's investigation, the FBI was involved at such an early stage. While the extensive search for the missing teenager under mysterious circumstances was underway, the manager of a company specializing in diesel engine repairs, North Carolina Power Systems, contacted the police. She reported that one of their employees, Daniel McCaw, had been absent from work for 4 days and was not responding to calls. Considering this was out of character for him, and he had never gone missing before, she asked the officers to visit his home and check on him. The officers arrived at his house in Orting, Washington, a 45-minute drive east of Olympia, and knocked on the door, but there was no response. Daniel's German Shepherd dog ran out through the doggy door. Simultaneously, they detected a foul odor of decomposition, prompting them to search for an entry point into the house. The officers gained entry through an unlocked door leading to the laundry room. Inside, they found Daniel lying on the floor. He was in a pool of blood and had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Initially, they assumed that he had taken his own life as there were no signs of forced entry. However, there was no weapon near the body, and subsequent investigation revealed a gunshot wound to the abdomen, and multiple stab wounds. Insects actively swarming around the man's neck suggested a possible throat wound, but due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was difficult to determine with certainty. At the crime scene, they found 9mm and 45mm casings, as well as 2 empty holsters. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator or perpetrators had used 2 different firearms, which were likely stolen from the victim. The man lived in an elevated area of the neighborhood, and neighbors reported that only residents and the mailman accessed the area. Initially, it was unclear how the perpetrator could have muffled the gunshots. However, it turned out that locals were accustomed to using firearms, but they did not interfere in each other's affairs. They lived in relative seclusion, so even if someone heard something, they wouldn't think to call the police. The boss of Daniel mentioned something very interesting during the conversation with the police. Just 2 weeks ago, Daniel broke up with his fiancée Amanda Olufsen. Amanda also works at North Carolina Power Systems. She has a son named Gabe, and her Gabe is the same Gabriel who disappeared a day ago. It's a curious turn of events, and now the investigators had to determine if there is any connection between the disappearance of the 16-year-old boy and the murder of the 51-year-old man. Fortunately, they could ask Gabriel himself about it. They found him in the evening of August 2nd in Thurston County, just 3 miles away from where his car was found. Gabriel was discovered in the woods. He was alone, in the dark, wearing only shorts without a shirt, shoes, or even socks. When the detective asked him what had happened to him, Gabriel replied that he didn't remember anything, and didn't know where he had been. His answer seemed strange to the police. There were no scratches on Gabriel, but if he had been wandering in the woods for 36 hours, there should have been at least some abrasions on his feet. This also didn't match the blood found in his car. It appeared that Gabriel may have been under the influence of drugs and couldn't remember the events of the past 36 hours. Until the teenager decided to change his story. He confessed that he was the one who broke the phone because he was afraid the police might find something incriminating on it. He added that he couldn't say what had happened to him because he feared harm would come to him. This was an extremely unusual and troubling statement. However, without the ability to demand an explanation from the boy, and while investigators were trying to figure out what had occurred, they released Gabriel back home to his family. However, the next day, Gabriel's father, Kenneth, called the police. He stated that his son was indeed involved in Daniel's death, but he only did it because he was coerced by Daniel's biker friends, who wanted to steal something from the victim's safe. Kenneth claimed that the biker gang approached his son because Gabriel knew the layout of the house well since he had lived there. They threatened to harm the boy if he refused to do what they wanted. It was then that Gabriel shared his troubles with his friend Justin Yoon, and together they devised a plan. However, the evidence collected by the police told a completely different story. The police did establish a connection between the victim and the Amigos Motorcycle Club, a club associated with the notorious Bandidos Motorcycle Club, but they found no evidence that they played a role in the murder. Furthermore, a few hours after the body was discovered, one of Daniel's friends, also a member of the club, visited the victim's home. He was genuinely distraught when the detective informed him of Daniel's death. In any case, it was essential to determine what was in the victim's safe. Daniel's mother provided the police with the safe combination, mentioning that they would be shocked and surprised by its contents. She mentioned that Amanda called her and said no one knew how to open it. When the detectives opened the safe, they found around 212 different types of weapons and ammunition, as well as some coins stored in plastic packets. A jewelry box was empty, and several packets contained pills with illicit substances. The notepad contained details about his biker club. On the bottom shelf, there was clearly something the size of an ammunition box. The investigators were fortunate that Daniel took his safety very seriously. In addition to weapons, he had several cameras in his house. They helped the police determine how the events unfolded on the night of the murder. The detectives found out that on August 28, Justin and Gabriel went to Lake Panther for a weekend getaway with their family and friends. Shortly after midnight, they left the campsite and returned around 6:30 in the morning. Their relatives didn't know where they had been, but the surveillance cameras at Daniel's house showed exactly where they went. At 1:50 a.m., two young, slim guys approached the victim's house from the backyard. One of them had a canister of pepper spray or something similar on his belt. The guys had their faces partially covered with masks. One of them was wearing a baseball cap and a medical mask, while the other wore a ski mask. They used handheld flashlights. The young men entered through the dog door. Nothing happened for a while until the homeowner exited the garage at 2:41 a.m., entered the house, and didn't appear on the video again. Just 6 minutes later, the camera captured his German Shepherd quickly running out of the house through the dog door. The unknown guys exited through the side door, then wandered back and forth between the house and the garage for a few minutes, carrying some items that looked like either a toolbox or a military ammunition crate. Finally, they fled the crime scene at 2:52 a.m. They took something resembling either a toolbox or a military ammunition crate with them. Gabriel told his father that when Daniel entered the house from the garage, Justin chased after him, stabbed him, and then a gunshot was heard. Gabriel went to the garage because the safe was located there. He claimed to have heard 2 gunshots at that time. The guys disposed of the weapons near Daniel's house and returned to their normal lives on August 29th. However, Gabriel disappeared before the 31st. According to his statement, bikers tracked him down, pulled him out of his car, and hit his head on the steering wheel, leaving blood in the car. Then the kidnappers put him in a Suburban and drove around with him for a while, beating him, before finally releasing him. They also inexplicably took his shirt, shoes, and searched the car for the stolen item from the safe, but since he didn't steal anything, they found nothing. Thus, the teenager decided to present a version that he was also a victim, just like Daniel. However, this version doesn't fit together as a whole. If bikers really forced the teenager to commit the crime, why couldn't he quickly enter the house and escape? If, as Kenneth said, they planned it, was it not about completing everything as quickly as possible? It didn't make sense. Again, if the plan was to steal something, why did they even enter the house when the safe was in the garage? Regardless, on the evening of September 2nd, officers came to Justin and Gabriel's homes to search and arrest them. They found a black mask in Gabriel's car and a black ski mask and a handheld flashlight in Justin's house. After the police arrested the teenagers on September 2nd, Gabriel showed the investigators where he had discarded the weapons. Near the old Olympia brewery in Tumwater, the detectives recovered a 9mm Ruger handgun, and a .45 caliber Sig Sauer pistol, similar weapons to the one used to shoot the victim. They also found over a dozen knives. The guns were inside a box for ammunition, the same kind that went missing from the victim's safe. The true motive for the crime is not revealed, but although Daniel did have friends among the bikers, besides his friendship with them, the police found no evidence that they intended to steal anything from the man's house or, let alone, kill him. However, the motive for the crime may be hidden in Gabriel's past. Despite his young age, he has faced many challenges. When Gabriel was only 3 years old, his parents divorced and engaged in a terrible custody battle, and Gabriel and his older sister found themselves at the center of this feud. According to a court decision made in 2010, the children spent weekdays with their mother and weekends with their father. The decision was not revisited when Amanda remarried twice and then separated from a husband who was abusive towards her. However, when she moved in with Daniel in 2018, Kenneth took her to court, claiming that the children's grades dropped, and they constantly skipped school. He also alleged that Daniel was aggressive and threatened Gabriel with a weapon and even threatened the boyfriend of the now 20-year-old sister. When Daniel got involved in the custody battle, he admitted to shouting at the sister's boyfriend but denied threatening him. The boyfriend broke into the house and stole a phone charger, which sparked the conflict, but now he regrets how he handled the situation. In any case, in 2018, a judge decided to have 12-year-old Gabriel and his 16-year-old sister live with their father on weekdays and with their mother on weekends. But the turmoil did not end there. In January 2019, Gabriel's sister was expelled from school due to poor grades. The girl told the school psychologist that her father behaved aggressively, especially when he drank, and that he had forcefully grabbed her wrist. It is unknown whether this was true or if Amanda and Daniel influenced her to gain full custody. But this had only a temporary effect. The final court decision was to have the children live with their father. All this happened against the backdrop of Amanda and Daniel's arguments. Daniel's boss said that his loyalty to the biker club could have been the reason for their breakup. The woman refused to compromise with the club and gave him an ultimatum, her or the club. It is not known what his response was, but on August 13th, approximately 2 weeks before the murder, neighbors saw her moving things out of his house. During this time, Gabriel befriended Justin Yoon, who also had a history of getting into trouble from an early age. In middle school, he threatened a classmate with a knife, and in high school, he was accused of making false bomb threats. Therefore, he had to change schools as soon as the school year began. The boy was very interested in weapons, and there are many photos of him at the shooting range. Together with Gabriel, they were troublemakers at school. It is possible that Daniel's murder was revenge for how his relationship with Amanda ended, or perhaps the woman knows more than she is telling. In any case, only a teenager could come up with a story of a biker gang sending a child to do their job. Currently, Gabriel and Justin are being held at the Remon Hall Juvenile Detention Center. They are facing several charges, including first and second-degree murder. The bail for each teenager is set at $1 million due to the high likelihood of them attempting to escape. Gabriel has already staged a disappearance in the past to avoid punishment for his actions, and Justin's family was seen packing their belongings into a car when officers arrived to arrest him, indicating that they were likely planning to flee. The teenagers will be tried as adults. It's worth noting that in May 2021, the Supreme Court in Washington ruled that individuals under the age of 21 cannot be automatically sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So, if they are found guilty, they may be eligible for release after serving 20 years. On a grey autumn day, a young Parisian girl, as always, was returning home from school, hoping to drop the heavy backpack off her shoulders and grab a snack. But as she approached the apartment building where she lived, she encountered a young girl who started a conversation with her. It didn't take much effort for the girl to convince the young girl to come with her to her apartment. The schoolgirl probably didn't see anything alarming in this since, after all, it was a petite girl and not an unfamiliar man whose mind could be filled with all sorts of thoughts. Besides, they were neighbors and lived in the same building. The girl followed her new acquaintance. But as soon as she entered the apartment, the door slammed shut, and a nightmare began that is hard to describe in words. 12-year-old Lola Davy disappeared, and she was never seen alive again. It was Friday, October 14, 2022. Johan and Delphine Davy were waiting for their daughter Lola to return from school. The girl knew that on Fridays, the family would go to their family cottage in the city of Béthune, a 3-hour drive from Paris. Therefore, she understood that she shouldn't linger. Lola was a very obedient child and never went anywhere without permission. The school was only 200 meters away from home, so the girl should have been at the door any minute. So when the clock struck past 4 p.m. and their daughter still hadn't arrived, the parents knew that something had happened. Johan and Delphine Davy not only lived but also worked in this building. It meant that Johan had the opportunity to check the surveillance cameras to see if his daughter entered the premises. To his surprise, the girl had arrived 45 minutes ago, and she wasn't alone. She entered along with a girl whom the man didn't recognize. The girl made a hand gesture as if inviting Lola to follow her. Judging from the video, the girl didn't seem entirely confident, and the young woman appeared unsettled as well. The parents handed over the unknown girl's photo to the police. Delphine also posted her picture on Facebook, stating that her daughter was missing. She described how the girl was dressed and added that she was last seen in the company of an unfamiliar young girl. The woman urged anyone who might have any information to contact the police or inform the Davy family. Thousands of concerned citizens shared this post. People took to the streets and participated in the search for the girl. The search continued for several hours when at 11:20 p.m., a homeless man entered the inner courtyard of the house where Lola's family lived. Perhaps he was looking for a place to sleep or something similar. Regardless, his attention was drawn to a large plastic suitcase. What he found inside the suitcase made him immediately rush to find a police officer. Inside, the police discovered Lola's lifeless body. Subsequent autopsy revealed that the cause of death was asphyxia. Additionally, there was a deep wound on her throat, and her body was covered in bruises and cuts. The perpetrator had bound her hands and feet and, before placing her in the suitcase, left behind a strange final mark. On Lola's soles, the numbers 1 and 0 were written in red ink. The last person who saw her alive was the girl who appeared with her on the surveillance cameras. But who was she? It didn't take the police much time to find her, and when they did, their hair stood on end from the chilling story that unfolded before them regarding Lola's murder. The investigators decided to review the footage that the girl's father had started watching. An hour and a half after Lola returned home in the company of the stranger, the same girl exited the house. She changed into different clothes and carried a suitcase and two smaller bags, with wheels. It was the same type of suitcase that they later found Lola in. It became clear that the mysterious stranger was at least involved in what happened to Lola. The police decided to question possible witnesses to see if they saw where the girl went after leaving the building. It turns out she unsuccessfully asked passers-by for help with the bags because they were heavy, and she was struggling to handle them herself. Despite the usual friendliness and helpfulness of the French people, they didn't assist the girl. Perhaps it was because she looked and behaved strangely. Her makeup was smudged, and she muttered something to herself. At some point, she entered a cafe and bought a croissant. Meanwhile, the suitcase stood in the middle of the street, and pedestrians wondered what was inside because, according to some witnesses, it smelled of chlorine and had some red stains. However, it was evident that no one could have imagined that there was a person's body inside it. One witness, who turned out to be a breakthrough for the police, also saw the girl enter the cafe. She approached him and asked if he could give her a ride. The girl promised a reward for his help and stated that she needed to transport organs. In other words, she asked him to participate in an organ trafficking scheme. The man got scared and refused to give her a ride. However, he parked his car a little behind and observed what she did next. The girl appeared distraught and was talking to herself. It seemed strange to him, so he continued to watch. At 6:30 p.m., a car arrived, the driver loaded the suitcase and bags into the trunk, and drove away with the strange girl. It didn't take long for the police to find the car driver, a chauffeur for the VTC company named Rashid N. He confirmed that he knows the mysterious girl named Dabia bin Kayed, who is 24 years old, and they had once dated. Dabia called him and asked for help with her belongings. He arrived as requested, without asking too many questions. Rashid drove Dabia to his home in Aulnay-sous-Bois, a suburb of Paris. There, the girl asked for permission to do laundry and took a shower. She borrowed his clothes while hers were being washed. Around 10 p.m., they went out to grab a bite to eat and returned when Dabia was ready to go home. However, Rashid stated that he had just brought her there and wasn't planning to make the entire journey back at that time. Nevertheless, he called another VTC car for her. The arriving taxi driver noticed that the passenger had heavy suitcases and hurried to help, but Rashid rudely rebuffed him and ordered him not to touch the luggage neither now nor when they arrive at their destination. The girl got into the car, mentioned an address, and they set off. When they arrived, without getting out of the car, the girl made a phone call to someone. The conversation was conducted in a slightly raised tone. Dabia asked for help, but she was refused. It was later revealed that she called her sister, who lived in the same apartment building as Lola's family. Dabia asked her sister to come down, let her into the house, and help bring the suitcase and bags up to the apartment. However, the sister, obviously aware of what Dabia represented, said, "I won't help you. I don't want to know what's in those bags, and don't bring them here at all." Unable to come up with a solution, Dabia dragged the suitcase and bags into the inner courtyard of the house and simply threw them there. Afterward, she called a friend and asked to spend the night at his place. Apparently, after getting rid of the suitcase, Dabia calmed down completely, and she and her friend spent an entirely ordinary evening, laughing and having fun, as if nothing had happened. Just 2 days after the camera captured Lola and Dabia together, Dabia was arrested. The police tried to find out everything they could about the girl. She came to France from Algeria 6 years ago with her mother and 2 sisters. In 2018, 2 years after moving, the police heard Dabia's name, but as a victim, when she suffered from domestic violence. Her relatives and friends describe her as a very religious person, and her ex-boyfriend even added that she was obsessed with the church. However, they explain that she changed after her father, who remained in Algeria, passed away, and in 2020 her mother died due to cancer. Dabia couldn't cope with the loss, started talking to herself, became more aggressive and unstable. but it is known that she had episodes of rage even before her mother's death. In July 2019, she had a confrontation with the hospital administration. When asked to pay for the medical treatment she received, Dabia got furious and attacked the staff, stating that she didn't ask to be treated, so she shouldn't have to pay for it. When she was escorted out of the building, she threatened to come back. And she added that they didn't know what she was capable of. Despite this outburst of rage, the girl had no reason to be taken to the police when she was arrested in August 2022. The girl was no longer studying, and she had no right to stay in the country. However, since she had no criminal record, she was released, given a 30-day period to sort out her documents or leave the country. But the girl did neither. She simply disappeared from the official authorities' site. She didn't work, didn't have a permanent residence, and was officially considered homeless, although she had actually moved in with her sister. Her older sister admitted that Dabia had been showing obvious mental problems for some time. She couldn't cope with failures, and every time she was told no, she would explode. However, Dabia refused treatment, and her sister didn't know what else she could do. During the interrogations, Dabia admitted her guilt in the incident several times but then retracted her statements. When the police showed her the footage of how they found Lola, she claimed that she felt neither hot nor cold from those images. She also added that she had been mistreated as well and that her parents died before her eyes. She told the investigators that she lured Lola into her sister's apartment, where she forced her to undress and take a shower. Dabia assaulted her, then tied her hands and legs and taped her face with duct tape. As confirmed by the autopsy, as a result, Lola first lost consciousness and then her life. Dabia, as if nothing had happened, drank coffee and listened to music. Then, for an unknown reason, she made a slash on the lifeless body, either with a knife or scissors. Then, Dabia unexpectedly retracted her statements and claimed that she would never commit such an act against a child, accusing an unknown armed person of the crime. She then revealed that she was not fighting with Lola but with a ghost. Later, she returned to her initial confession. And this time, it seems that the investigators were able to uncover a bizarre and even more inhumane motive for the crime. Dabia recounted that shortly before the murder, she approached Lola's mother, addressing her as the building administrator where her sister lived. She requested an electronic card, a pass to the building, so that she could come and go as she pleased without having to ask her sister to let her in. Delphine had such authority, but she refused the girl because technically she did not live in the building but was her sister's guest. Dabia, not accepting no as an answer, harbored resentment towards Delphine, and when she saw her daughter on the street, an exact copy of her mother, fury boiled inside her, and she decided to seek revenge. In other words, she committed the murder because at the age of 24, she was not accustomed to being denied and wanted all her whims to be fulfilled. Investigators believe that at some point, the attack shifted from the apartment to the basement of the multi-story building, where they discovered clear signs of a struggle. However, there are still some aspects that the police do not understand. For example, certain things indicate some kind of ritual, such as the numbers on Lola's legs, and Dabia's admission that she drank her blood. In any case, the police confidently dismiss the version of organ trafficking on the black market. They consider it just another stroke in the psychological profile of the accused. Dabia has been charged with murder, torture with violence, cruel treatment of a minor under the age of 15, and concealing a body, which can carry a sentence of up to 30 years of imprisonment. However, it's possible that she did not act alone. Initially, the police arrested 5 more individuals. First and foremost, Dabia's sister was arrested since everything happened in her apartment, and the basement of her house. However, the police later determined that she had no knowledge of the crime, and was not at home during the incident. The other 3 suspects were also released fairly quickly, and their names are not even disclosed. But it's not as straightforward with 43-year-old Rashid, Dabia's former boyfriend, who was charged with concealing the corpse. The girl claims that he is the mastermind behind the crime. It doesn't work in his favor how abruptly he rejected a taxi driver who wanted to help Dabia with her suitcase. It was precisely because of those words that suspicion fell on the man as well. Did he know what was inside? He claims that he didn't know what was in the suitcase, that he didn't open it, and had no idea about its contents. In the first week of November, a closed hearing was held in the case. The judge commented that the accused appeared completely calm. At the moment, the main question is whether the crime was the result of Dabia's nervous breakdown, or a decision to seek revenge against Elfin. If she is found to be mentally unstable, she will be treated by psychiatrists in an appropriate specialized institution. If she is deemed fit to stand trial, she will be prosecuted. In early December, the psychiatrist who examined Dabia provided investigators with his report. He described her as a highly dangerous individual but not suffering from a mental disorder. In other words, although she is not entirely stable, it does not make her insane or incapable of being held accountable for her crime. She is fully capable of acknowledging that her action was terrible, unlawful, and that she should be judged for it. Of course, Dabia's lawyers will likely insist on additional consultations with specialists in the field of psychiatry. Currently, the defendant is being held in solitary confinement in the Fresno prison. It is the second largest prison in France, located slightly east of Paris. The media reports that she rarely goes out for walks and enjoys watching television. Allegedly, every time she sees herself on TV, she expresses joy and does not hide her pride in herself. Since Dabia had been living illegally in France for several months leading up to the crime, politicians seized upon this story to raise the issues that interested them. They hastily declared that there are deficiencies in measures against illegal migration in France because many crimes committed in the country are attributed to migrants. In other words, if they had deported Dabia in time, today Lola would continue to attend school, engage in gymnastics and figure skating, and simply enjoy life with her parents and older brothers. However, Lola's parents believe that politicians are simply using the tragic death of their daughter to score political points. Johan and Delphine themselves have decided that it is unbearably difficult to remain in Paris, and they have left for Pas-de-Calais, where they originally came from.